process of monetizing property. In other words, what it is we are developing tokens which actually truly represent the volume and aging, even the life cycle of all of the things that we intend the tokens to represent. And so they must in fact follow the life cycle of each and everything that they represent to, in volume, automatically maintain a circulation as mathematically perfected economy alone does, which circulation is at all times equal to the remaining value of all represented property. So we understand from this that the first crime of these publishers of our promissory obligations, which we call a banking system, and more properly a central banking system, so-called at least. Banking is not their only business. This is why I keep saying purported banking system or quote banking system unquote. They're not just a banking system. This thing that they have done is an ancient ruse, which is the riddle, if you will, of what the ancient phraseology means, temple of the money changers. So our issue is to rectify money, to restore it to its natural state simply by removing the offenses which have been committed against it, by obfuscating it into this changed form of money. Now the second crime, of course, is that by imposing interest upon all these artificial debts, that this implicitly obligates us to maintain a vital circulation by perpetually reborrowing principal and interest that we pay out of the general circulation in the way of servicing the ever-escalating sum of debt as new debt, perpetually increased by so much as periodic interest on an ever greater sum of debt until we suffer the present terminal failure. So the second crime is, of course, above and beyond the vast injustices which are inflicted by both crimes. The first crime alone, that this obfuscation of the currency launders all the principal into the possession of mere publishers of our promissory obligations to each other, the evidence of our promissory obligations to each other, not even to the banks. This first crime alone is phenomenal because it transfers into the possession of the banks so much as all the value of all the principal which is ever created in this way. And of course, the second crime is even terminal. But we should oppose it even if it were not terminal because of all the injustice, further injustice which it reaps upon us, which is that it multiplies artificial indebtedness as a means of dispossessing us to an ever greater and ultimately complete and terminal way. So we learn further that increasing prices are a consequence of this latter process of inherent, irreversible, and therefore terminal multiplication of artificial indebtedness. That is, the cost of servicing the ever-escalating sum of debt, as those costs are saddled upon industry, forces industry to increase its prices that it asks for its products in order to maintain margins of solubility over servicing the ever-escalating sum of debt. Now, we learned also that increased interest rates multiply artificial indebtedness all the faster. In other words, at a higher rate of interest, as we're paying more interest out of the circulation and reborrowing that back into circulation to maintain a vital circulation, because the rate of interest is higher, we're paying more out, therefore have to borrow more back into circulation constantly just to maintain a vital circulation. So higher rates of interest escalate the rate of failure. But a thing that I also covered in discussing my paper, Interest is Usury, is that any rate of interest which requires reborrowing back into circulation, eventually, as it inherently and irreversibly multiplies the sum of artificial indebtedness in proportion to the circulation, it inevitably terminates the so-called economy nonetheless, because it multiplies artificial indebtedness in proportion to the circulation. So from this, we learned that Ron Paul's unqualified pleas for higher interest rates would only terminate the pretended economy all the faster. So we know that interest is the cause of price inflation, not purported circulatory inflation, as Ron Paul constantly admonishes us to believe without qualification. He continues to decry the sums of money which are necessarily coming into circulation because of the multiplication of artificial indebtedness by interest, without accounting for how much is being paid out of circulation. Now, if he was right that we have inflation, and in the very beginning of my discussion I explained that actually if debt is collateralized, it's mathematically impossible to even suffer inflation. Now we have the breaking of the rules of the system because more and more circulation is required, and that's does possibly allow us to increase the circulation. But if the circulation were increasing, we would have more money than before. We would be able to afford more things unless the prices did go up, because industry has to increase those prices because they're supporting all this greater weight of ever greater debt. Ron Paul does not account for this intrinsic deflation, which is attributable to the obfuscation of the currency. And no argument which claims we're suffering vast amounts of circulatory inflation is valid unless you account for how much we're paying out of circulation. And if you don't think that, if you don't realize how phenomenal that sum is of deflation, imagine how much of everything you spend on everything is going toward principal and interest on a debt related to the manufacturer of that, to owning the equipment that transported it to where it got. Everything, all the money that you're paying out of circulation against your home, all the a vast amount of insurance costs, because insurance is such a corrupt trade now, or industry, are going toward the same kinds of things. Which when you account for it all, it's phenomenal amount of perpetual deflation, and so it requires a phenomenal amount of reflation in order to maintain a vital circulation so long as we can. Well, now, in truth, as I said also, we've been in the failure for quite a while, and you might relax. You think, oh, well then, we're okay then. This is what a depression feels like. Well, no, it doesn't, because it isn't, because the lifespan of the system has been artificially sustained to this point by pouring money into it and alleviating artificially the weight of bearing the further burdens of these debts. While, as we said, Reagan tripled the entire previous 200 years of federal debt in 7 years. He reduced taxes 10% per year for 3 years and then restored them to what they were, and really they haven't gone up since then. And the reason is we can't afford further taxation, and that's another reason that there has to be further federal overspending, because they can't afford to increase what they're taking in the way of revenue to afford the increasing costs of which are manifested to increasing costs of government, just of what they were doing before. And then when you add to this Band-Aid upon Band-Aid and all the expenses of doing the wrong things, you have a phenomenal further, increasing in federal deficits. But they have to happen under this obfuscation of the currency in order to reflate the circulation in the time of the end, in the period of failure. So we also spoke then, covered well enough the fact that you cannot rescue this pretended economy because all of these methods of artificial sustention are likewise increasing indebtedness. And the fact that the debt was too much to withstand is the very reason that you enter failure, being as the rules of the system are that you can only borrow further money into circulation, it can only get worse. So you can forestall it, the actual conditions of failure, by saying by artificially relieving the people of the burdens, that of a responsible federal government would be paying off as it accumulated them. But the fact of the matter is, you very soon in such a system get to a point where you can't be paying off all these things, and then you start accumulating these deficits in government. Why? Because in private life we're not allowed to do that, because that would more or less reveal the inappropriate nature of the system. And in fact, nonetheless, this is happening around us, and we see that people are, their mortgages are being restructured and whatnot, to a small degree. And always, it isn't rectitude that draws the line what they're restructured to. No, it isn't a recognition of the proper principles, because then we would get rid of this system, and the banks would even offer to do that if they were that kind of people. Instead, they're just lower them enough that you can barely afford to tread water. And that's that. So what happens in such a system then is that it inevitably fails. And a part of the reason for that is that the methods of artificial sustention likewise have their limitations. So they can continue for some while, and then it's over. You find that you've exhausted all these artificial things to do, which by divorcing yourself from principle, you embarked on these experiments while, 30 years ago, some fellow's been telling you, hey, all this was going to happen, and these are the reasons it's going to happen, and this is the degree to which it will happen until it's terminal, and this is the only solution for it. And why did government go ahead and do that anyway? It's hard for many people to realize that government could be so corrupt, but so it is. These are the facts that we have to contend with. So we're not appealing to a benevolent Big Brother. We have a malevolent Big Brother, which is our worst enemy. And in fact, most people recognize this in the attitudes that I'm constantly exposed to of people who are who have lost hope. But nonetheless, if we stood together, and this is the purpose of these programs, if we stood together, we would prevail, because even the worst government couldn't deny us these things. Not today. Not after 200 plus years of a constitutional republic, which has been gutted by looters in its final days here. So nonetheless, what happens then is the system can completely collapse, and as in the Great Depression, we might go on for some while, 10 years, and some people falsely believe that the Second World War got us out of the Great Depression. Not at all. It could have been a war. It could have been the things that Roosevelt was trying to do, but that wasn't enough, just as it can't be enough now. He had to do more. He had to go from that and take the further steps and say, well, that didn't solve the problem. So what is the problem? It has a root, and if I was around saying all these things and he just gave me a deaf ear, he would be at fault, as every president, since including Gerald Ford, has been at fault, because they have been presented exhaustive papers on mathematically perfected economy, on why this economy would only fail as a result of this process by which we have to maintain a vital circulation, and in so doing, this artificial indebtedness to mere publishers of